Architectural Outcast.
Randy here from the Architectural Outcast. The use of architecture as part of the world building is really well done in Oblivion, but there's no such thing as a perfect design. As good as Oblivion is, it still has its shortcomings, and I'm going to make the argument that its worst shortcoming is the city of Bravil, and it's not even close. The world building completely falls apart because it's unbelievable. The reason why Bravil fails is because of the philosophical and aesthetic choices that Bethesda made that keeps undermining their world building. The failure is also a result of the underlying assumption that led to those philosophical and aesthetic choices. It reveals a rather nasty socioeconomic prejudice. Simply put, Bethesda doesn't seem to like poor people much. South and a little east of Imperial City is the port city of Bravil. The port sits on Nibbin Bay, which has river access to Imperial City to the north and the ocean to the south. Historically, rivers were the primary method of moving goods in and out of and around a country, and Bravil sits on an ideal location at the confluence of a number of rivers and roads. Bravil is located on an island, and outside of Imperial City, it is the heaviest defended city in all of Cyrodiil. Even the docks are heavily defended. They're inside the walls at the center of the city. In a previous video, I talked about another one of Cyrodiil's port cities, Anvil. And just like with Anvil, we already have a lot of information about Bravil. We already have expectations of what we will find in the city. Bravil is a port city. There's a lot of trade, lots of goods moving in and out of the city, a lot of money changing hands. Bravil should be a wealthy city. Anvil's your classic seaside port. People from different parts of the world are coming in and out of the city on a regular basis. This is reflected in the architecture, local building traditions with foreign influence. Bravil is a river port town in the center of Cyrodiil. We should expect to see much less foreign influence in the architecture. The first thing that you realize when you come rolling up on Bravil, this is one tough nut to crack. Nothing's impossible, but you and a couple dozen of your best friends aren't knocking over this city on some random Tuesday. You do not go to all this trouble fortifying something unless there's something worth guarding. And we have a major hint what they're guarding with those gates at water level, the docks. Bravil is a major economic hub, as well as being a major link in the supply chain, bringing goods in and out of Imperial City. And somebody, I would argue wisely, doesn't want to take any chances in that supply chain being broken. Somebody has spent a lot of time, resources, and more importantly, money building up the infrastructure of Bravil. Those of y'all who've been to Bravil know exactly where I'm going. Prepare to have your expectations destroyed, because Bravil is the slums of Cyrodiil. I keep yammering on about how the developers' philosophical and aesthetic choices are causing unnecessary world-building problems that keep snowballing over time. Well, the worst snowball is Bravil. On one hand, their philosophical and aesthetic choices undermine their world building, and on the other hand, they completely destroy the world building. With the stables, we get some foreshadowing, telling us that the city is going to be made out of wood. Bravil's materiality, being built out of wood, fits in with its environment, because there's lots of trees all around the city. This is where we get to the part where the developers are actively undermining their world building. Bravil is supposed to be the bad side of the town, the part of Cyrodiil the Tourist Information Board wants to forget. Bravil's stables are supposed to symbolize its slum status by being poorly maintained, dilapidated, and run down. But they look like every other stables outside of every other city, including Imperial City. So what's the big deal? I might have mentioned a time or two that boards are an anachronism in a world with medieval level technology. For the purposes of this discussion, though, we're going to assume that boards are so readily available and cheap that poor people can use them to build their shacks, shanties, and hovels. Beware of shifty architect types bearing gifts, because that concession should warn you there are bigger problems in Bravil than boards. Let's talk about the structure of the stable. It's post and beam construction, and it has heavy-duty cross-bracing, big X in the square. And then we have that angled wall with even more massive posts. And the roof is made out of massive rafters. The structure is telling us that this building has to be capable of resisting weather coming from a specific direction. But yet, the wall facing that direction is only one board thick, incapable of resisting severe weather. Meanwhile, other walls in the building are made out of wattle and daub, which are capable of resisting severe weather. Why? And then to make things completely farcical, the building is roofed in just boards. This building is uninhabitable. Why are there structural elements coming up through the roof? Unless you detail where they come through the roof properly, flashing and stuff, which I don't see, you're just going to have water running down those structural elements into the building. Which raises the question, why did you brace this building to resist the weather so thoroughly when you're just letting the weather come into the building all willy-nilly? It gets worse. One side of the building is all braced against the weather, but the other side of the building is flat. If the weather is bad, as one side of the building is telling us, this side of the building acts like a sail, wanting to cause the building to flip over. And then there's the boards. No, not the anachronism part. Even if boards are cheap enough for poor people to use them to make their hovels, you don't lay them on the ground and then build a building on top of them. Not if you want the building to last more than a year or two. Talking about the gate and the entrance to Bravil, a city with this level of defenses should have a gatehouse or some sort of fortification on this side of the bridge. And the bridge should be a drawbridge. This is the wrong type of bridge for a port city. Just not sturdy enough to allow the amount of traffic that would be required to move goods in and out of the city. The gates to Bravil are very similar to the gates of the other cities we've seen so far, but they're stripped down and utilitarian. The gates of Anvil, Skingrad, and Imperial City are trying to impress people. They're trying to say, we're great, and yeah, you don't want to mess with us. The gates of Bravil are saying, we don't really care what you think of us. You want to attack us? Go ahead, we dare you. The wood superstructures on top of the towers are historically accurate. My one main quibble, the stone towers on each side of the gate should be stone one more level up, but it still looks believable. This is where things start to go off the rail, though. The built world, as shown, is actively contradicting itself and undermining the narrative. As you dig into Oblivion's story, through quests and what have you, you learn this city is under bad management. It's rife with incompetence and corruption. And these battlements, deteriorated and parts missing, are supposed to symbolize how the city is being allowed to fall into rack and ruin. The first problem is another issue I keep raising. If everything is shown to be dilapidated and in poor repair, then nothing's special. So, what's the big deal about Bravil? It's no different than any other place we've seen. The second issue is what the developers think they're symbolizing versus what we're actually interpreting from the built world. These battlements, the wood elements, are built out of planks. And unlike boards, planks are historically accurate to a medieval technology level. Wooden battlements like this would have been made out of planks. Why? Planks, like boards, do weather, but they don't rot as fast. In fact, they can last a very long time. How does wood rot? There's basically two methods. High heat and low humidity will get you dry rot, and then constant exposure to moisture will get you the more traditional rot. Bravil is surrounded by hardwoods and cypress trees. Lack of humidity isn't a problem. And all this wood is on top of the battlements. If they're being regularly exposed to standing water, this city has bigger problems than this wood rotting. If we're not talking rot, it would take a long time. We're talking potentially generations for the battlements to get into this type of condition. The story of Oblivion is an empire in decline, and a symptom of that decline is that Bravil has been allowed to fall into disrepair. But what's going on here isn't short-term lack of maintenance. There can only be one of two possibilities of what's going on here. First, the walls and battlements of Bravil would have been expensive to build and would be expensive to maintain. And for whatever reason, the Empire decided a couple generations ago to stop maintaining the battlements and walls, and the bridge for that matter. If Bravil was a frontier town on the edge of the Empire, and an empire in decline, running short on money, looking to cut costs, it would make sense that they would stop spending money on Bravil's defenses. But Bravil isn't a frontier town. It's a major port city and economic hub. More importantly, it's an important link in the supply chain, bringing goods in and out of Imperial City. Goods like food and clothing. So, we're supposed to believe that multiple emperors have allowed the primary source of food coming into Imperial City to deteriorate to the point it is almost no longer functional? I don't think so. The second possibility is that the empire fell a couple generations ago, and whoever's running the city today no longer has the resources or the skills to maintain the battlements. As soon as you walk through the gate, immediately the impression is reinforced that these are people living amongst the ruins of the past. The city, as portrayed, makes absolutely no sense. First off, why aren't the roads paved? This site was so important that somebody went to all the effort and expense to put up those walls and battlements, but yet they couldn't be bothered to pave the streets. The whole reason why Bravil exists in the first place is it's a port city, and no one could be bothered to build a paved road connecting the docks to the paved road running past the city. There is the possibility that the streets were paved at one point, but over time the cities become so full of muck and mire, the paved streets become buried. Streets have been buried under muck and mire throughout history. But that's always associated with social collapse, where people for long periods of time no longer have the energy, time, or resources to keep the streets clean. Part of the problem are the buildings. In of themselves, they're fine. Being made out of wood isn't an issue. They're based on historic examples. And the structure? Yeah, I could run around and point out, this wouldn't work, that's not realistic, yeah, that's a joke. But overall, close enough. And of course, this level of deterioration is just silly. These buildings are beyond uninhabitable. They're dangerous. The problem is the exterior of Bravil doesn't match the interior. The exterior of Bravil is a cocky, self-confident city, indifferent to the opinions of the world around it, looking to pick a fight. Whereas the interior of Bravil is small, nervous, huddled together, turning its back on the world, hoping nobody notices it. These two things don't go together. They don't match. But wait, it gets worse. We're told Bravil is in this condition because of corruption and mismanagement. The local lord doesn't know what he's doing. But then, why is the Fighters Guild in a building in just as bad a condition as every other building in town? Why is the Mages Guild a dump ready to collapse? The Fighters Guild and the Mages Guild are empire-wide political factions outside of the local lord's control. And in every other city, there's some of the biggest, most expensive buildings in town. But yet in Bravil, both guild halls are uninhabitable hovels. One of the hardest things for a new architecture student to learn anybody involved in any creative activity for that matter, is the ability to share their creative ideas with others. You're revealing to the world how you think, what your priorities are, and what you value. A friend of mine used to always say she would feel so vulnerable, it was like being naked in front of everyone. Bethesda's exposing their butts to the entire world because on one hand, they're revealing they don't understand the concept of ownership, and on the other hand, they're expressing some very interesting socioeconomic, shall we say, biases. Ownership is more than legalities. It's about what you internalize. Speaking of cities, y'all will notice whenever there's a protest, it usually takes place in spaces with ambiguous ownership. It's spaces that belong to the city, the community, the people. Because the ownership of these spaces aren't clearly defined, most people think it's not their responsibility to deal with the protesters. It becomes a conflict between abstract groups, the city versus the protesters. But whenever protesters start going on to property with clearly defined ownership, that's when people start to get pissy, because it becomes very clear who's in the right and who's in the wrong. Ownership of space defines how we think of ourselves and communicates to the world important information about us. And the world judges us based upon the spaces we own and specifically how well we maintain and take care of those spaces. There are definitely ambiguous spaces in Bravil, like the fountain, where it's believable that if the city, the officials, the local lord don't maintain the fountain, the rest of the people would say, not my problem either. You could also make the argument that whatever is going on with the roads is a similar situation. If the local lord and the city aren't maintaining them, the people would say, not my problem. The guild halls are a completely different story. They're part of their public image, tied into their reputation. It's how they recruit new members. They would never allow their buildings to get into this condition. But you say, Bravil is so mad, this is the best that the guilds can do? The guilds would shut down their halls and pull out of the city before they would allow these buildings to damage their reputation and their image. Just to add another layer of complication and absurdity to all of this, despite Bravil being so horrible, the cathedral's able to maintain itself. Finally, we come to the average citizens' homes, and we're left with the question, why were they allowed to get into this condition? We know that in Cyrodiil, there is private ownership. I mean, as a player, you can buy a house in every single city, including Bravil. And in feudalism, there was private ownership as well. Yeah, the king might theoretically own everything, but just ask Prince John what happens when you try to enforce that. You might find yourself signing a little piece of paper at sword point. People tend to get real pissy when you try to take their stuff. You say, yeah, but that was just the nobles. The peasants, the common people, they didn't own anything. No. That's not the way feudalism worked, specifically in Western Europe. And particularly in cities, they encourage private property ownership. It's one of the incentives, the benefits of living in urban environments. Ignoring all of that, the game implicitly acknowledges property ownership. You go up to most doors, it will say, House of so-and-so. If the door is locked, and you pick it and go in, you will get in trouble for trespassing on that person's property. Just because the city officials aren't maintaining the public spaces doesn't mean that everybody else would stop maintaining their houses. But you see, this gets to Bethesda's biases. They show in all of Oblivion, actually they show it in all their games, but we're specifically talking about Oblivion, they show all poor people and peasants as being lazy, slovenly, dirty, and stupid. I want to tell you all a quick story about the poorest people I have ever personally known. And I grew up in one of the poorest counties in the United States, so I'm talking poor. In elementary school, I had a buddy, and his parents were friends with my parents, so I got to go to his house for a sleepover. When I got there, I discovered they didn't have indoor plumbing. Like I said, we're talking poor. The house had been added on quite a bit over the years. The layout was kind of weird. The oldest part of the house was the original log cabin from when they first settled, 1820s or 30s. At the time, 4 generations lived in that house, and it was their pride and joy. You could eat off those floors. These were people that would do anything for you. My family used wood heat in the wintertime. And one winter, it was pretty bad. We used up our wood faster than we expected. And in a snowstorm, they showed up, took me, my dad, my brother out. We cut down a bunch of trees, chopped it up stove length. And then when we came back, their son, my buddy, helped me and my brother chop up a bunch ready for the stove. All in a snowstorm. And when my parents wanted to pay for gas, they refused. They just wanted to make sure we stayed warm. These were people who had pride, self-respect, and personal dignity. If you tried to disrespect them, they'd knock your teeth down your throat. And that was just the women folk. Where I grew up, there were people who lived in rundown shacks, who had cars up on cinder blocks, and all the other hillbilly stereotypes you can think of. We had terms for people like that. They weren't liked. Not all poor people are the same. My buddy's family, like my family, were some of the original settlers in the area. In Ozark culture, that carries cachet, influence, soft power. The community listened when my buddy's family talked. Not all social status comes from stuff. Because of who our people were, my buddy and I were expected to act in certain ways, to carry ourselves with pride and dignity. If we did, we would be given that social status, that soft power. And it didn't matter how much stuff we had. Now, before you all say that's just modern America, Ozark culture, even by the late 70s and early 80s, was some of the last remnants of Elizabethan culture. The Ozarks were isolated for a couple hundred years after all, and Elizabethan culture is one of the cultures being evoked in Oblivion. Bravil is the worst city in Oblivion by far, for the simple fact it is unbelievable on so many different levels. At any rate, I hope I've given you all something to think about, and until next time, y'all be safe. If y'all are still here, thank you very much. While you're at it, why don't you like this video, subscribe to the channel, click that notification bell. You can hear me yammer on about something else next time. And feel free to share this video far and wide.
Please like and subscribe. Please leave a comment.